Starts now. And I think with that, we are good to go. So let me just show you briefly what we have planned for you today. So this is a brief introduction to Circularity and our CSAIL program, which this event is a part of. And then we will hear a keynote by Elise on the global e-waste monitor and very insightful results from that study that is a regular publication. Before then discussing some of these results with Stefan de Linde from Minimize and Simon Bryant from CCS Insight. And this is the opportunity also for you to jump in with your questions and make this a really insightful panel discussion. Your hosts today, so I'm Paul Wipkenberg, and please, Marianne, you can also wave in the camera. Or
also,
hello.
Very warm welcome from my side. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
So we are both co-founders of Circularity. Of course, there's a much larger team behind us. Circularity is the do tank and strategic partner for the circular economy. We work with companies in various industries to implement circular solutions, and especially on the initiation of new corporations. We have been doing that since 2018 in a number of different formats and in different industries. The electronics industry has been particularly close to our heart since 2022, which was the start of the CSAIL program, Circular Consumer Electronics, where we have already accomplished 2 sprints with a number of the partners that you see here. And we are about to launch the next sprint, which I will say more about in a second. The program is consists of 3 phases. We first expand knowledge and build a community around the topics that we want to tackle. This event is part of that. And then we will jump into a workshop with selected industry participants on specific challenges. So that's a very curated workshop over 2 days, very intense, but very insightful, which results in projects that are running over 3 to 4 months or accompanied by us over 3 to 4 months to transfer those ideas into self-standing projects after the workshop. And that is essentially the aim, to construct new collaborations and thereby solve circular challenges in the electronics industry. The next challenge, or the next sprint in this program, will be on the topic of recovery, recycling, and reuse of electronic components and materials. So that's a perfect fit to the topic of today. We've just concluded the sprint on repair at scale. If any of those are of keen interest to you, please get in touch. I'm sharing just here the barcode. Please scan it if you would like to know more or participate in the program. And we are looking forward to hearing from you. But with that, I don't want to hold it back any longer and jump directly into your keynote, Elise. So please be welcomed and take over the screen. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Let me start by sharing the screen, which should be this one. Okay. So can you confirm you can properly see the screen and
yes,
in full mode? Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to present today. A very short agenda of my presentation. I'll start with very few words on the UNITAR SCYCLE program where I work, and then we'll present the main insight from the Global E-Waste Monitor, the GEM 2024, which includes trends in e-waste generated and recycled, and potential for material recovery, as well as the challenges related to transboundary movement of e-waste, which is also one of the key topics for the webinar. So UNITAR SCYCLE at a glance. The SCYCLE team is part of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, and we are based in Bonn, in Germany. We have over 20 years experience in research in training and capacity building and policy advice in the field of electronics and e-waste. And we're expanding to other products such as plastic, batteries, textile, etc. And here you can see a number of our work and publication. And I believe the presentation will be shared so you can easily navigate through the links and make more familiar with our program. So today I'll give an insight from the Global E-Waste Monitor, which is, let's say, a comprehensive report that is produced by our team and ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. And this report provides detailed data on e-waste worldwide. We are trying to track the trends, assess the effectiveness of policies, and offer projection to inform policymakers, but also industry stakeholder, and more generally the public. About, of course, the growing challenge, but also the opportunities in managing e-waste. So it's a publication we are having since many years, not every year, unfortunately, but every 4 years or so. So what is the status of e-waste management globally in terms of generation and collection and recycling? So all the numbers you will see are reporting from 2022, although the report was published in 2024. It's just that it takes time for the reporting and then the processing the data. So in 2022, record 62 billion kilogram or 62 million ton of e-waste was generated globally, which is on average 7.8 kilogram per person per year. And what we can say is that out of this, only around 22% is formally collected and processed in what we call environmentally sound manner. Globally, from 2010 to 2022, the amount of e-waste generated per year nearly doubled. And this is outpacing the formal collection and recycling rates by a factor of 5. This is the difference you can see between the green line at the bottom and the black line. And we have also some projection after 2022 up to 2030. So the growth in e-waste is largely the result of course, technological progress, increased consumption, but also limited repair option and short life cycle and inadequate e-waste management infrastructure. In terms of geographical distribution, here you can see that Asia generated almost half of the world's e-waste with 30 billion kilograms. However, when you look at the generation per capita, Europe is well ahead with more than 17 kilograms per person. And on the right side, you can look at the green bar. If you look at the green bar, you see that the formal collection and recycling rates vary widely by region. And in 2022, Europe, but also Oceania and Americas generated the highest amount of e-waste per capita. But since they are also the region with the most advanced collection, treatment, and recycling infrastructure and capacity, they had the highest annual collection rate. On the other side, African countries have the lowest rate with less than 1% of e-waste formally collected and recycled. Looking now at the category of products, if you look at the left side, the small equipment such as toys, but also microwave or e-cigarette, for instance, they constitute the largest category of e-waste in terms of mass, accounting for 20 billion kilograms, which is almost 1/3 of the world's total e-waste. The second largest category is large equipment, excluding photovoltaic panels. And lamps instead is the smallest category if we don't consider PV panel, which is a more recent category, which is expected to increase largely in the next years. And as you can see from the figure on the right side, the collection ratio varies across product categories, with large equipment being the most collected and lamp in the other side, the least collected category. So why is e-waste collection and recycling important? Of course, there is all the environmental and health protection reason. I'm not detailing those here. I hope you are somehow familiar with that. But e-waste recycling is also important to recover valuable materials and contribute to a circular economy. The composition of e-waste varies by type of equipment, but it consists primarily of metal and plastic. And in 2022, all e-waste worldwide contained 31 billion kilograms of metals, of which an estimated 19 billion kilograms were viably recovered, and they were brought back into the circulation. So this means that still 12 billion kilograms of metal were lost, either can be in the compliant recycling process or because they ended up in non-compliant management scheme or dump sites. In terms of metal most successfully recovered, we have iron, which is known for its high recycling rates, while other metals such as zinc or lead had much lower viable recovery rates. Precious metals such as silver, gold, and palladium can be recycled also with very high rates in smelters. So for materials to be recovered at higher rates and without impacting the environment, e-waste shall be formally collected and recycled in what we call an environmentally sound manner, ESM. So in such a case, e-waste are sent to specialized treatment facilities where the valuable materials are recovered and hazardous substances are properly managed. However, currently, only 13.8 billion, almost 14 billion kilograms of e-waste follow this path. It represents 22% of the total. 14 billion kilograms, or 23%, are disposed of in residual waste bin, which means with other household waste, and therefore they end up most often in incinerator or landfill. And this is frequently the case for smaller items such as lamp, small IT device, or small equipment that the consumer has a tendency to simply throw in their house bins. Then we have 18 billion kilograms, almost 30%, managed by informal e-waste collectors and recyclers, often in less developed countries. So in such a case, e-waste are often collected door to door and sold for repair, refurbishment, or dismantling. Here, the dismantler are manually breaking down the equipment into marketable components and materials. And recyclers are usually burning, leaching, and melting, leaching, and melting techniques to convert e-waste into secondary raw material, which of course leads to significant resource loss, but also high environmental pollution, which pose a health risk for workers themselves, but also for the local community. And finally, we have 16 billion, or 26%, which are managed by individual waste dealer or companies, which are acting outside of the formal scheme in developed countries. So this is mostly under this scheme that illegal shipment may occur, and I will develop further in the next slide. So here, in this scheme, e-waste is collected and traded through various channels, as you can see. It may be destined for metal or plastic recycling, but hazardous substances are likely not properly depolluted. It may also be exported as uncontrolled e-waste or used EEE to developing countries which do not have adequate e-waste management infrastructure. So in some cases, the transboundary movement of e-waste or their components are necessary to recover high-value material. For example, transportation of waste printed circuit board to specialized recycling facilities. Hence, it's important to put in place rules and procedure to distinguish between illegal and legal transboundary movement. Europe, East Asia, and North America have the capacity to effectively manage hazardous e-waste, making this region the primary global importers of formal movement. In 2022, 1.8 billion of e-waste were shipped legally, and most of them through the Basel Convention prior informed consent procedure. So what is this PIC procedure? It's a requirement from the Basel Convention, which is the main international instrument regulating hazardous waste shipment and management. And according to this convention, before any export, the authorities from the state of export must notify the authorities from the state of import and potentially the state of transit and they must provide detailed information about the planned shipment. And the export can only proceed once authorities have given written consent. In 2022, the Basel Convention was amended to increase the control of transboundary movement of e-waste specifically, and making all e-waste, including also non-hazardous e-waste, subject to this PIG procedure. So there is now no shipment of e-waste that should go without this prior informed consent from the authorities. So this was about the controlled or the legal shipment, but e-waste are also subject to illegal shipment. And the main reason for this are from the exporter perspective to get rid of the waste at a lower cost by sending to countries where waste management is less expensive, but of course doesn't follow environmental requirement. And from the importer perspective, the incentive is to address the demand for cheaper second-hand used EEE. So indeed, in most cases, e-waste being moved are declared as used electronics for which shipments are authorized and not subject to the Basel Convention. And out of this 5.1 billion kilogram of e-waste estimated to be shipped across border, 3.3 billion kilogram, which is 65%, they were uncontrolled and undocumented shipment. So in simple words, they were illegal. Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central and South America are the main recipient region for those illegal shipments. And one of the primary challenges for authorities in controlling the transboundary movement of e-waste is indeed distinguishing between waste and used EEE, which is not waste. So e-waste for that may be falsely declared as used good or mixed with legal items, for instance. This is how they manage to ship e-waste illegally. So to conclude, let's have a few takeaways from my presentation. The collection and recycling of e-waste remain really too low compared to the volume generated, with notable disparities across region, but also per type of product. And this situation is posing serious damages and risks to the environment and human health, but also from an economic point of view, with the loss of valuable materials, especially metals and plastics. The illegal transboundary movement of e-waste exacerbates these issues by directing those wastes to countries lacking the infrastructure and capacity to manage them in an environmental sound manner. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and you can find all this information and much more in the Global E-Waste Monitor itself, also in other publications that you can find on our website. So I invite you to have a closer look if you are further interested. So thanks a lot for your attention, and yeah, open for question and discussion.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Elise. Very nice presentation, very precise and concise about those results of the Global E-Waste Monitor. Now, I don't see any questions, immediate questions in the chat. If you have one, this is your chance. You can just unmute yourself and speak up. If there are no immediate questions, then we will continue. We will continue with the panel discussion, for which I would like to invite Stefan and Simon to briefly present yourselves and explain to us and our audience what you're each doing, and then we will start with a few questions. Stefan, would you like to start, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul, and hi, everyone. My name is Stefan. I'm the founder of Minimize. We are a startup out of Berlin, Germany, that have been active in the e-waste space for about 2-3 years now. Our core activities include first and foremost project development of formalizing informal sector e-waste management. So We look at areas where these streams that Elise describes are very prevalent, where documentation is poor, where treatment might not exist. And we find local partners to see if we can help scale them up and in that process build proper treatment infrastructure. And with that, of course, we need then also a proper way to document that. So Minimize has developed their own software for documenting collections, treatment, origin, like documenting really where waste was collected, how it's been treated and where it goes. And effectively now basically bringing that software to as many of these players as possible to really try and see, can we get a documentation standard? Can we scale these projects even further across the informal sector, formalizing it in the process? So we do that in 5 countries at the moment, all kind of emerging developing countries, from Mexico through Zambia, Kenya, India. And slowly expanding. So you also will see Nigeria, Ethiopia, Philippines, Indonesia, etc. will slowly join on that list as we progress. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Simon, would you like to?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Paul. I'm Simon. I lead the research at CCS Insight, and we're a telecoms research firm. Been in business for a bit more than 30 years. And yeah, we track the circular economy for mobile devices, and I've been looking at it in quite a lot of detail over the last 3 to 4 years. And I think relevant to the presentation we've just seen, I think the significance of mobile from an e-waste perspective is it's the world's biggest tech market in terms of volume, and 1.4 billion phones are still sold every single year. And I think the other significant factor with mobile phones is they get replaced very quickly, still 3 years on average, while the life of those devices in terms of how long they can be used is actually much longer than that. Unlike many other electronics categories where consumers will tend to run them into the ground, and when they stop using them, they have little residual value or use in the market. Phones still have a value in the market. So you have this very, very strong secondhand market that is emerging very quickly globally. Europe is by far, I think, the largest demander of devices globally. So this is kind of growing everywhere. The challenge the industry is facing is there might be a demand for these secondhand devices, but the behavior to trade in devices is very different around the world. So the markets who want these devices tend not to be the markets where it's normal to trade in your device at the end of life. So markets like the US, markets like Japan, who trade in a lot of devices because they have this huge upgrade market. Apple want to sell their latest iPhone 16 Pro Max, and they get you to trade in a device. So you create all this volume, but then they ship it overseas because they don't want those secondhand devices, because actually that competes with this incredibly lucrative market for new devices. So they ship it overseas to markets like Europe in particular, but South America and other markets. So this creates a very strong flow of devices. You also have significant hubs globally, the Middle East in particular, Hong Kong in particular, that tend to perform a role of maybe the volumes that maybe want to go via compliance routes, via EU regulation, because the EU and lots of markets have rules around dumping devices and CE mark and so on. So the hubs are very important. But then the other thing I think is the final destination for markets, and Africa is often seen as the market who they want all these old devices, when in reality they can't necessarily do much with the very old devices. So so there's a number of very significant trade flows that we see emerging globally. That it's still a very dynamic space, but that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I immediately, there are many points in what you say, Simon, that I think are relevant to this discussion coming up. Actually, my first question would be to some extent to you and also to Elise, maybe because Elise, you clearly said like a massive amount, 80% of the global flows are not documented properly. So let's start with that problem. What would you think needs to happen for to get better data on documentation of those flows?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, a number of aspects that could improve the situation. Like, first of all, the reporting itself, because we need some standardized global reporting requirement. At the moment, at the EU level, it is in place, and our model is also expanding to other regions and countries, so that's a good thing. So it's improving year after year, but still a lot still remain to be done at this level. To support that, probably some digital tracking system are helping for sure. Stefan mentioned about their own app. Probably in the future, the European Union is trying to put in place what is called the digital product passport. So that will be linked to a specific product, and this should help the tracking of end-of-life devices. Of course, the involvement of all actors and better collaboration, this is always the key thing to support everything, government, industry, manufacturers, recyclers, everyone. And we have a big gap to fill in with the integration of the informal sectors. And this is where really Minimize can play a key role by really helping the informal sector to report on their activities, because in many countries, they are the biggest actor, let's say, in the waste management and e-waste management especially. So yeah, still a lot to be done, but there are already some improvement, and what could help is probably having some mandatory reporting in certain regions, and also eventually some incentives from governments to support this reporting.
Yeah, understood. Simon, do you have anything to add, or should we?
I think the digital passport is key that Elise has highlighted, and I think that will help considerably. I think it becomes an EU initiative that EU is leading the way in many respects in terms of EU initiatives related to tech and electronics. But it's interesting, at a global level, lots of companies and countries see that as Europe just putting up barriers to trade and movement. And there's a lot of resistance to what the EU is doing, I think, when you speak to companies globally who just want to move this stock. But the EU passport is a very sensible idea, I think, and yeah, the obvious answer.
Yeah, I think many people are putting lots of hope in the DPP, so we're also very excited about that development and working on it in other groups. Stefan, you probably also have something to say about this topic, but I also wanted to just highlight again that so these 30% that are collected or 20% documented doesn't mean that all the rest is not recycled. And you in particular looked at formal and informal recycling systems in a number of countries. India, for example, employing 2 million people in the informal recycling sector. So just as a question to you, like, what do we need to improve our data? But also, how can we incorporate those informal recycling systems that are clearly there?
Yeah. These, of course, are very complex questions, but what I think is really important here, building on the data from Elise, a lot of people like using that 2080 of that 2278%, right, of documented for environmentally sound recycling. We even put it on our website, right, as kind of our main mission is to documenting the undocumented. And what we indeed often see is that people misinterpret the data by saying 78% is not being recycled. That's absolutely not true. But we do have to, building on what Simon also said, and really make sure that we understand that devices, whether they are e-waste or maybe untested electronics, they tend to follow the path of the least resistance. And if there is not the proper incentive in place to document, then you can jump high and low. But it's cheaper to not document, it's cheaper to not spend that effort. It's and we might know the benefits in this circle here, but I think it's really important to start showing these benefits to the brands involved so that they can, start setting these incentives together with us and start understanding, wow, if I really document, I see positive outcome from the general public, from governments, from the environment itself, obviously. And that requires indeed, so besides incentives, a standardized, realistic, frugal documentation methodology that anyone can follow, not just created, in a bubble, let's say in an office somewhere in Europe, but can be really implemented on the ground. And then through those two steps, incentivization and proper documentation, trying to really bring that out and start showing the benefits to everyone involved so that it multiplies. Now, as in terms of bringing on informal sectors goes, this is it's a very complex field. First of all, you deal with some opposing forces. So you have countries who want to formalize informal sectors and maybe introduce EPR to do so. But then at the same time, they might penalize an informal sector worker for not having paid taxes in the past. Or we might see informal sector workers actually being fearful of formalization because it might mean that they lose their jobs, these kind of things. And so it's really important, in my eyes, beyond that, to say these systems need to be designed inclusive of the informal sector. We cannot just say the informal sector is, should be banned or something like that. It's actually, we should lift them up and build skills together with them to say, look, if you document, you can actually earn extra with that. You can position yourself better on a global market and thereby scale. You can actually ride that wave rather than fighting against it. So very complex and a long process, but I think step by step, definitely achievable in that way.
Yeah, very interesting. I think this role of the informal sector will be critical to expanding, of course, EPR systems also. And maybe one next question would be, what can, for example, European companies that bring devices to the market, what can they do to actually support this?
You asked me? Sorry.
Yeah, it's an open question. You can respond first because we were on the topic, but if you, Elise or Simon, have something to add, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I can drop a few cents on it and then happily also give that to Simon and Elise. So in terms of companies bringing devices placing devices on the market, right? I think actually your own research, Paul, Marianne, also really highlights the fact of how longer life cycles are good for general sustainability as a whole. And I think that brands in starting to look at the informal sector, like formalizing informal sectors and including informal sectors into the recycling economy as a whole, being able to build trust and traceability, will also be able then to include those in the market and the life cycle of the devices that they bring on the market by feeling maybe more trusted in involving them in giving those devices another life in Africa, for example. This could be a very important point there because they now suddenly know and have contributed to proper recycling infrastructures in the same country where they place those devices. So it's really something that as well producers in Europe, US can actually sort of work together with the consumer in India or in Southeast Asia, or Africa.
You want to add anything, Elise or Simon? Otherwise, I have a question related
to
that.
training hat. Indeed, also probably having some partnership between manufacturers and local recyclers, and through that transferring technologies, best practices, infrastructure, this kind of very concrete and practical support, maybe.
Yeah, I think the points mentioned now, and also you, Simon, talked about it earlier. The second-hand trade is, of course, increasing massively worldwide, and we see Asia and Africa as drivers for the demand, and other regions more for the supply. And in our study that you also mentioned, Stefan, we also published that we really see that import and export also for Europe as a very critical enabler for the second-hand market to work. Without international trade, it could never be as it currently is and as it seems to be developing and growing. So maybe a question to you, Simon, like how can we, because that brings with it the question, how can we enable second-hand trade to prolong life of used devices, all by ensuring nevertheless a safe recycling at the end of life? Do you have any ideas about that? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean the second-hand. I mean, ultimately it needs supply, and I think the goal for a lot of companies is this idea of end-to-end circularity. Is this idea of you find the stock, you create the supply, you refurbish, and you sell back, and you take responsibility for that full cycle. And I think lots of companies are looking at that now because they don't like this dependence on other countries, on other companies to provide the supply. I think the realization in a lot of countries now is this is no longer a linear supply chain where you can pay a company to pay another company to create your supply. Now you have this very uncomfortable reliance on consumer behavior and changing consumer behavior. And that is proving a real challenge for a lot of companies. So if you want to create that supply at the moment, you need to collaborate with other countries and other companies to bring that product to you. But I think a lot of companies are now saying, actually, longer term, we want to figure out how we maintain control of the devices as they come in, as they're refurbished, and then we sell back to consumers. That still presents a challenge that people in different countries want different devices. So people in Western Europe want newer devices. People in Africa are very happy with older devices, typically for cheaper prices. So invariably, there will always be this different demand for different types of secondhand devices in different countries. So that's another factor why I think the flow of devices will always be there globally. But invariably, you do have a kind of force that's making companies figure out how they control that supply chain more and more locally.
Mm-hmm. And Elise, do you have an idea of like how, also from a legal perspective or from a documentation perspective, in the end, we can better separate these two and distinguish between second-hand flows and illegal waste flows?
Well, there are already some guidelines for authorities to follow, but the issue here is let's say the quantity compared that is traded compared to the time that authorities can allocate actually to the because it requires testing to know if a product is still functioning or e-waste. Most of the time you will need to test it unless there is a broken screen and it's obvious it's waste. In that case, you can easily decide, but otherwise you will need time to run test, functionality test basically. And besides allocating more time, resources, and building expertise and capacity building, it's difficult. And then already at international levels through the amendment of the Basel Convention, there is improvement from the legal side, but in practice, it remains a real issue for authorities for sure. And there is no easy answer to this one.
No. It is a challenge, right? Because you see that, I mean, also Simon said that, and this is also like in our report where we did the impact assessment for rental and second-hand models, we see how important to maximize impact the international trade is. Because if there is no demand in one market, it is absolutely crucial that we reallocate useful devices that can still be used to other markets where they can still be used and where they can create value, rather than just putting them into recycling locally, right? And sometimes there's like discussions that people say, okay, let's close our borders and let's just put everything to recycling. But really, from a resource perspective, this is not the best thing that we can do. Although we have to like have this also now this discussion of where we have to keep the resources inside the country, etc. But really to have this like to allow for a market for international trade for used devices to really maximize the value created by the resources, and then still manage the e-waste problems that associated with undocumented trade or illegal trade. This is really a challenge, but it's so important that both of it works together, right? Somehow.
But you know, if I can just add a point to that, you know, I think yeah, there's this very clear discussion or debate in the industry of saying, look, if there's secondhand devices, it's healthy to use them, to give them a second life. But then there is this opposing view in the industry that says against the flow of devices, if you stop those devices, it forces companies to look for devices locally via local trading schemes. So, you know, that's where there's this kind of opposing argument of saying don't allow the products in, because that forces local companies to invest in their trade-in programs to supply locally. But that's the forces we see. But generally, I think the overriding force is if there's products that are used and there's markets for those devices, then you should let the flow of devices flow. But there are some quite strong views, I think, against that as well. Because, you know, if you're a big carrier in the mobile space, and you know, it's expensive and it comes with a lot of risk to offer trade-in programs, because people sell you stuff that doesn't work when they say it's a grade A device, or you don't know how much money you have to offer them to actually get that device out of the drawers and back to you. There's a lot of risk, there's a lot of cost to it. And fundamentally, if somebody from overseas is offering you a cheap phone in bulk of good quality, you're going to take that at the expense of investing in a trade-in program. So yeah, there's the kind of opposing thoughts, which I think create some debate in the industry.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what we also saw is that the volumes of the different, I mean, we can speak about device types, but then we also have to speak about device grades. So
yeah,
then let's say the quality of devices demanded in, for example, Western European or in the US is very different again from other places where maybe people are happy to take more of a compromise on the let's say optical or the visual quality of a device. So I think they're even within very strong trade-in programs, would be my hypothesis, you would probably need an exchange between countries, a cross-border movement of devices for that to work. But I think there's another flow of trans-boundary movements that I would be keen to explore with you a little bit, because I'm not sure that is really covered yet, and maybe Stefan, you have a view on that. Like the reverse flow of components and materials to produce new products and devices. I mean, what happens if we have recycling in countries like India, etc.? What happens with those materials or spare parts, for example, right? That are taken out of those devices, which, from my understanding, is a lot more likely in an informal market where people actually manually dismantle devices to take out parts, whereas in Europe, the recycling sector most often shreds fairly quickly and then sorts the material flow. So what's your view on that stream of reverse flow of materials and components for production of new goods?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. So on one hand, sometimes we might discuss on this topic of what the informal sector is taking e-waste apart in an environmentally unsound manner. Or for example, like as Simon says, you bring devices maybe to a market without waste management infrastructure, and then like, how are you going to, as a brand, stand behind that, right? That you do that. Are you going to take accountability for the waste that it might generate in the future? But then also on the other hand, an informal sector in actually almost anywhere where I've been is probably a lot more circular than you've ever seen in Europe. So it's maybe a bit, yeah, under a bad light for the working practices, and I would definitely not advocate for everything that's happening there. But the repair capabilities and skills that exist of extracting spare parts, reusing them, almost nothing gets wasted until it's actually waste. And that's then basically, of course, the problem that we face there. So if I look at that specifically, anything that has a value in the informal sector will at some point find its way into a recycling stream generally. That's sort of a broad statement to make there. Metals will most likely always be sold to someone who can smelt them into new metals. Plastics is a little bit more difficult. It happens, but of course you have this problem of identifying them. Spare parts, I would say, if we see informal sectors extract spare parts, which is very common, they get used a lot. Reverse flow into new products, I'm not so sure, because we're a few models behind at that point, right? In the informal sector, it's not like you're going to find spare parts for an iPhone 16 or something like that in Nairobi. But still, I think there's a huge opportunity to at least, whereas now these materials kind of just flow back into the market and we don't even really know much about the origin. There is actually a story to tell where we said, did you know that came from waste? Spare parts there are already extremely commonly reused. And I think there's more skill that we could learn here about how to use that in Europe than before we would probably see them be reversely shipped back for our products. That's an assumption, what I see there. Yeah.
Elise and Simon, anything to add to that?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, because what I see is that what we see in Europe is, of course, that there's a high cost pressure on the recycling processes and the recyclers in general. So they have trouble basically defending their quality of recycling against the cost pressure that is imposed on them by let's say those who give the money, so the OEMs and the retailers, etc., who bring the devices to the market, and that have to pay the EPR fine and then basically put pressure on the recycling system through that. So they're complaining about this cost pressure, and at the same time complaining about being prevented from using everything valuable in these waste streams because of scavenging and cherry picking of valuable components that happens before they even get the waste. So how can we, or what could be strategies to improve the situation also for recycling in Europe, for example, in order to relieve this price pressure and also maybe solve for this competition between recycling in Europe and the illegal exports, which are of course then saving costs.
$1 million question.
Yeah.
I guess there are already some incentives, or they are about to come for using recycled materials instead of virgin ones by the manufacturers. There's a lot going on at EU level, like the Circular Economy Action Plan, this kind of action and many projects ongoing and associated funds going into that. But indeed, it's a key issue. Yeah, definitely.
There's we get this question, even though we're not recyclers, is can you supply us with recyclates, right? Plastics, metals, etc. Can you show that the origin of some material is from waste? Because the demand for these recyclates is actually really high, and the supply is maybe up and coming, but still quite underdeveloped. So,
and what's the problem of that supply? Is it the amount, or the quantity, or is it the quality?
For plastics, it can be the quality, especially, and the ability. So in Europe, shredding just prevents you from ever really getting plastic out of your recycling streams. Like if you don't sort out plastics before you shred it, there is no way you're going to get those shreds sorted by types of plastics anymore.
Yeah.
In developing countries, emerging markets, it's a little different. The manual sorting that at least happens also with partners that we support really allows us actually to identify. You look, and I mean, labor cost enables that. Right? Low labor costs allows you to look at a plastic fraction and say that's polypropylene or polystyrene, and then you can sort it out, right? I'm not, unless there is some technological innovation in Europe that would be able to substitute for that kind of like skill that these people have with just looking and feeling, basically. And I'm not sure if I would see that in Europe so quickly, doing really within the market. So maybe it's actually more of a statement to say, then make these areas, involve them into the recycling market, involve them, make them into these recycling powerhouses that can do that, and make them part of that resource game rather than dumping the waste on them and maybe extracting something back, but actually say, can we build them up as plastic recycling powerhouse, for example? That's, I mean, it's not necessarily my domain of expertise, but I think it could be really a way to bring that market together and bring recyclates to any producer, basically, that wants them. They would need to involve these markets closely.
Okay.
I haven't mentioned yet, if I may, because there is also a role that manufacturers themselves could have in facilitating, or let's improving the recycling through this design for disassembly, design for recycling perspective. So by improving already at the product manufacturing side, the end of life management, then it can probably improve the whole situation and help recyclers minimize their cost and improve the quality of their product. That's also an aspect.
Yeah. I think also in general, also like to, and this is also what we are seeking also to foster with these kinds of discussions, right? To have a greater transparency about how these flows are all interconnected. And I think this is also why Stefan, I think the Minimize is doing a fantastic job in then creating the transparency and working with EPR systems and help building EPR systems up. Because what we saw in our research for the impact assessment, which I also posted in the chat, is that there's very little transparency. So when we asked industry like providers of IT devices, so where do your devices end up when you sold them, they typically said, I have no idea. Or even retailers, rental companies, whatever, typically there's very limited knowledge about this whole international trade of used devices and of e-waste. And I think so. The first step is also to create this transparency and this awareness also in the beginning of the value chain. Let's say this is also why in the report that we published, we decided to introduce a systems map where we explain, like an industry map, where we explain how these models are actually working and how they're interlinked and what role like import and export plays and the global market. CCS also provided some data which we published in the report. So there's also some data and some information on this, because the first step is that also the producers and the people putting devices on the market also understand how this connection is and how the awareness, and then also think about what should my role be also along the whole value chain, right? So do I get active in the collection of devices? If I put like 2 million on the market, should I also be involved in bringing them back, or should I at least care or at least know about where the devices will likely end up and what will happen with them? And is there any way that I can influence in a positive way what's going to happen with these devices and how we can recover these resources? So this is a very important step.
We are close to having to finish this this webinar, but I would like to ask each of you just maybe in one sentence, what do you take away from this discussion? What would you like to highlight once more before we have to close? Elise, do you want to start?
Well, I would say there are already a lot of positive steps going on, positive activities going on, and yeah, in simple words, a lot remain to be done, but still we see progression, and it's important to indeed involve all actors to continue into this good progression to see overall the situation improve. Yeah.
Thank you. Stefan?
Yeah, excuse me. So collaborate and share, I would say, is really most important. Our data is open source, so if anyone wants to look at that, that is always possible. And we share, for example, with UNITAR, with ITU, with Paul. We've also like we try to always share and collaborate on networks, etc. So I would say that to really anyone, only through like making these kind of experiences and knowledge available to anyone can we solve it together, because hiding or protecting your activities in that sense doesn't really help anyone. So yeah, most of our stuff is open source and available to anyone that wants to use it, and I would invite anyone that is interested in this stuff to just use it, like it's there for using.
Right. Simon?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the discussion. It's been a huge eye-opener for me. And, I think what we've always noticed in our research is the OEMs initially said, we don't really want to know about the secondhand market because that competes with our market. So they kind of tried to ignore this secondhand market. But now they're becoming aware that they have to take notice of it because it's cannibalizing their business. But within the secondhand market, people don't really want to talk about the stuff that doesn't get used. There is this sense of, oh, it's traded in, but it has no value. So that gets recycled. But when you try and understand, well, what happens to it when it gets recycled? Where does it go? It's something that people don't really want to talk about. It's kind of like we hand it to another company, they deal with it. And it's clearly a key story that, for me, this discussion has helped bring a lot of that together, I think. So it's been very useful.
Fantastic. Yeah, I also take away a couple of really new things from your presentations and your inputs. I think we need better documentation, more data on the flows of waste. We need to enable the flows of secondhand devices to enable our circular economy of these devices. And we need to incorporate and build on the informal sectors and build them up to help us build a system also in those countries that can really do an efficient and environmentally and safe recycling. So I really thank you for your participation in this webinar. Thank you very much for contributing. I will just show you that the timeline for our program is starting in about September for the next sprint. So there's still some time for any of you in the audience to let us know if you're interested to participate and shape this together with us. And in the meantime, I wish you a very nice afternoon and evening, and hope to look forward to seeing you soon again at one of our events in the near future.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the
Look forward to seeing you
discussion.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.